Meanwhile, let's go ahead and drop in with Dan from Canada, yeah?
Yeah, Dan.
Hey, Dan, I get that you are not impressed by the Pope talk. Tell me what's on your mind.
You know, it's not that I'm not impressed by the Pope talk. I mean, I'm a Canadian. People talk about the royal family. They get really big into these things that have very little direct consequence to them. I mean, you can have a great Pope. You can have a terrible Pope. But your Catholic neighbor is going to do whatever your Catholic neighbor is going to do. So, you know, I don't know who the Imam of Iran is or who the religious leader of Israel is or anybody else in the world. I'm aware of Catholics, so it seems like it's important. But the Catholic leadership is no more important to me than the Southern Baptist leadership or anybody else.
I get that. And I think the only, to kind of follow that metaphor, the only contrast I might draw is in the scope, right? Like you may be more familiar with the Dalai Lama than you are with some other like local regional monk or monasteryist in any form of religion. But the Pope is significant just due to sheer size and scale. I may not off the top of my head know the president of this corporation or that corporation, but I am at least aware of the doings of folks like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk because of the significance of the power that they wield. And I would argue that it has a factor in daily life. Now, some of the like more tabloidial stuff and the way people really fawn over, you mentioned the royal family, for instance, I do think that that's a great comparison. And I'm not interested in getting into any of that sort of stuff. I don't need to dig into the history of any of these folks and really lose sleep over whether we're going to get a good pope or a bad pope. Because, it does seem like it's going to be a crapshoot, and it doesn't seem like the policies of the church are going to change dramatically. And it's a hard thing to truly ignore. I don't know. How fair is all of that?
I think you're definitely right that it is a hard to ignore cultural phenomenon that's going on. I think in your country, there's a bigger focus on it than mine. You guys have had news about the Pope, and I haven't seen national news talking about the Pope other than his death and the fact that they're going to choose a new one. But there is so much going on and so many more things that are just vitally important to the day-to-day that a religious leader of any significance is only moderately significant.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And, truthfully, I think that the correlation between important news stories and fundable news stories or popular news stories is much looser than we should all like it. That's a evergreen complaint that definitely applies here.
And I mean, sorry, go ahead.
Dan, I want to jump in on that. I don't know that I necessarily think that it's only moderately important. I think as far as the Pope is concerned, there has been such a revolution over the last 500 years in Western culture that the Pope doesn't have as much power as he used to. But the thing is, if we don't continue to speak up and combat the abuses of Christianity, we very well could maybe end up back in that position. And you don't have to look far to see something like that. To answer your question, the Ayatollah Khomeini is not only the religious leader of Iran, but also the head of state. The leader of Iran. The head of state is actually their president, who is elected separately. The Ayatollah is elected by a parliamentary body, and they serve for life. They have control of their own military, and not only that, but they have control of the international relations arm of their military, the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, who has what's called the Quds forces. And the Quds forces, you might have heard, are the people that go out and train terrorist groups and fund terrorist groups around the world. They see to the destabilization of the countries around them, like Iraq, which is still overrun with Shia militia groups, or otherwise known as SMGs, that come from Iran. And this kind of funding and this kind of influence, we see a worst case scenario with a religious leader that has access to a global community, right? The Pope, in a sense, also has access to a global community. The thing is, though, we have taken steps as Westerners to take their weapons away. They still have an enormous financial and cultural impact, to where even if your neighbor, like you say, is doing whatever they're going to do, that may be true. Maybe your neighbor in the open is a proud Catholic, but behind closed doors is having maybe a same-sex relationship and sinning in other ways, listening to death metal, who knows? But they're also donating huge sums of money to a Catholic church that says LGBTQ community and women are second-class citizens and white males are the top tier. That's a major problem for me. And so that is why it's so important for me to stay in tune with who is the next leader and what will their message be? Whose goals and whose aspirations will they reflect, and what will will they impact? And those are questions that I have. You know, there is kind of this tug of war within the Catholic Church, as if it's its own political body, between a more progressive pope and a more traditional pope. Will we get someone who's friendlier to the LGBTQ community, or will we get someone who reflects more medieval mindset? And that is an actual schism that's happening right now. There are political compromises made. There are promises made to world leaders, to cardinals, to different members of the Vatican government. And we see that play out over the course of the time that they're voting and changing their votes, as, you know, in conjunction with what they might get by their choice. And so, you know, I'm sorry, I don't mean to lecture you. I just have a lot to say about this, as far as the Catholic Church being very much a power structure that has far-reaching implications, as opposed to just being some kind of benign thing that's out there and doesn't really impact us. I would have to disagree there.
I have to agree with you that benign would not be the correct description.
Okay,
there is a vast amount of power, political power, financial power. But there's a vast amount of political power and financial power with Bezos.
Sure.
I mean, and from what you were telling me about Iran, it sounds like that's actually a more prominent place to be focusing news stories on than the Catholics. I'm not trying to be dismissive of its importance. I just think with everything going on in the last 24 hours, because, you know, before yesterday, everything's cool. You know, with everything going on, it's dropped down a tier.
Sure. Yeah. And I don't think that either of us would argue about how, you know, different news outlets set their agenda or what gets the A block posting. Yeah, that's certainly not a thing that we have any real meaningful say over. I'd like to think that we can vote with our dollars or whatever else, but the state of news media coverage is definitely a very real problem in our modern world. Is the Pope getting too much or not enough attention? I would argue not getting the right type of attention. And I think that this is often true when we see a symbolic head of state die. The way that is covered and talked about may not line up with my values. But, you know, we all are here trying to pay attention to the things that we feel like we ought to pay attention to. And this is certainly something that I think falls into that list, however we slice it.
I think we're all pretty nearby in our positions, so
sure.
I'm not going to throw in an argument or anything. I just that was my 2 cents. That was the poll question, and I appreciate your guys' feedback and the.
So I want to. If I may, I find this stuff really interesting. I'm sorry. International relations is my field of study. And so I would like to ask you a question. So did you hear that Jeff Bezos, right, is now making Amazon sellers list the price increase of the most recent tariffs from the United States? Did you hear that?
I have not, but I've been boycotting Amazon. So
okay, but that is somebody who is exercising his platform to affect politics, right? Jeff Bezos, while he may not be a religion, is certainly atop a power structure in a very different way than the Pope, but still has a platform to take an idea and to affect people politically and affect their lives, maybe even change the way they vote, simply by posting one country's economic policies in a place where we're not used to seeing economic policy, right? And so he has used his power to essentially insert himself into the American political arena. And nobody probably ever saw that coming, except if you considered maybe the financial support that he was able to provide, maybe some donations or campaign support, things like that. But nobody ever thought, well, he's going to start posting economic policy impacts on the American citizenry. I think that is fascinating. And, it's just an example of the way that somebody who is at the top of the structure that you would normally think doesn't have that much of an impact can actually change their tune and change their methods to have a very significant impact. And so I would just ask people, maybe look at other power structures in that regard. Dan, are you much of a reader? I have a book recommendation for you that helped me, I think, look at power structures in a very different way.
I'll take a recommendation.
It's called The Retreat of the State, and it's by Susan Strange. And the interesting thing is that, and she's the late Susan Strange. The interesting thing, it was written in 1999 before the information age. And it turns out that she was actually kind of right about some of the things that she had to say when you look at different power structures and the way that they develop and influence the world. I don't think the Pope is any different. And she does have a section on religious organizations and leadership in there. So I think that you should check that out. And you might find that, useful.